December 26th, 1996, 1:05 p.m. John Ramsey opens a basement door, sees his daughter's body, and makes a decision that would destroy crucial evidence forever. He picks her up. He carries her upstairs. He moves her from exactly where the killer left her. And the question investigators never properly asked was, why didn't he call for help first? Why didn't he preserve the scene? Why did a businessman who ran $1 billion company make such a catastrophic error in judgment? Unless it wasn't an error. Unless he knew exactly what he was doing. For 28 years, we've been told this was about an intruder. We've been told this was about a ransom note. We've been told this was about DNA evidence. But what if we've been asking the wrong questions entirely? What if the most damning evidence wasn't what happened during the crime, but what happened after it? What if the cover-up began not with a killer trying to escape, but with a family trying to control a narrative that was spinning out of their grasp? Tonight, we examine the behavior, the timeline inconsistencies, the calculated decisions made in those first crucial hours, the grand jury that heard evidence we never saw and reached conclusions that were hidden from us for 14 years, the sophisticated legal maneuvering that kept a family from ever facing trial despite evidence that convinced 12 citizens they should be charged with child abuse resulting in death. This isn't about DNA. This isn't about intruders. This is about 3 people who knew more than they ever admitted, who acted in ways that made no sense for innocent victims, and who had resources powerful enough to control an investigation for 3 decades. Before we examine the behavioral evidence that's been dismissed and the grand jury testimony that was suppressed, subscribe to Unresolved, a Case Study, and hit that notification bell. Here at Unresolved, a case study, we ask the questions others won't. We examine the evidence that makes people uncomfortable. We believe that wealth and influence should never place someone above scrutiny, especially when a child's life has been taken. Leads, no matter how powerful the people involved. If you've ever wondered why no one has been arrested in this case despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, what decision by the Ramsey family do you find most suspicious? Now, let's examine the behavior that convinced a grand jury this family was hiding the truth. December 26th, 1996, 5:52 a.m. Patsy Ramsey makes a 911 call reporting her daughter kidnapped. But according to enhanced audio analysis conducted by aerospace engineer Paul Ginther, the call doesn't end when Patsy believes it does. The line stays open for 6 additional seconds, and in those seconds, investigators believe they captured 3 voices. John Ramsey saying, "We're not speaking to you." Patsy Ramsey saying, "Help me, Jesus." And a third voice, young male, saying, "What did you find?" If that third voice belongs to Burke Ramsey, it means the family's core statement to police was false from minute 1. They insisted Burke was asleep, that he didn't wake up until hours later, that he knew nothing about the crisis unfolding in his house. But multiple audio analysts, including those employed by the FBI, believe Burke was not only awake during the 911 call, but was actively participating in family discussions about what had happened. This wasn't a memory lapse. This wasn't trauma-induced confusion. According to multiple statements given by John and Patsy Ramsey to police, Burke slept through everything. His sister's disappearance, his mother's screaming, the arrival of police, the search of the house. He was described as a heavy sleeper who heard nothing and saw nothing. Yet the enhanced audio suggests otherwise. Why would the family lie about Burke being awake? What were they protecting him from? What did a 9-year-old boy know that his parents felt compelled to hide from investigators? The answer may lie in what happened next, because within minutes of that 911 call, the Ramsey family began making decisions that would systematically contaminate the crime scene and compromise the investigation. These weren't panic-driven mistakes made by traumatized parents. These were calculated actions that followed a specific pattern. Maintain control, limit exposure, manage the narrative. First decision. Instead of waiting for police alone, as instructed by 911 dispatch, the Ramseys immediately began making phone calls. John called his pilot to arrange travel to Atlanta, not Michigan, where they were supposed to go for their planned family vacation, but Atlanta, where Patsy's family lived, and where they had established legal connections. He made this call before police arrived at the scene. Second decision. They called friends and family to come to the house. Fleet and Priscilla White arrived first, followed by John and Barbara Fernie, followed by Reverend Roll Hoverstock from their church. By 7 a.m., less than 90 minutes after the 911 call, multiple people were moving through what should have been a secured crime scene. Third decision. They allowed these friends and family members to prepare food, move through various rooms, use bathrooms, and handle items throughout the house. Every surface touched, every room entered, every item moved was potential evidence being contaminated by well-meaning people who should never have been allowed inside. These decisions created reasonable doubt by design. If DNA, fingerprints, or other physical evidence was later found that pointed toward the family, defense attorneys could argue it was contamination from the friends and family who had access to the house. If evidence was found that supported the intruder theory, it could be presented as proof of their innocence. Either way, the Ramseys had created multiple explanations for any physical evidence that might be discovered. But the most telling decision came at 1:05 p.m. when John Ramsey and Fleet White were sent to search the house again. They went directly to the basement. Fleet White later told investigators that John Ramsey seemed to know exactly where he was going. He walked straight to the wine cellar at the far end of the basement, opened the door, and according to White's testimony, turned on the light and immediately began screaming. The question isn't whether John Ramsey was devastated to find his daughter's body. The question is why he immediately contaminated the crime scene by moving her. John Ramsey is a businessman who ran a billion-dollar company. He understood protocols, procedures, and the importance of preserving evidence. He had spent 7 hours with police who had explained the importance of not disturbing potential evidence. Yet when he found JonBenét, his first instinct wasn't to call for investigators. It was to remove duct tape, untie bindings, pick up the body, and carry it upstairs. Detective Linda Arndt, who was managing the scene, later described her shock at seeing John Ramsey emerge from the basement with JonBenét in his arms. She had specifically instructed everyone not to touch anything they found. She had emphasized the importance of preserving the crime scene exactly as it existed. But John Ramsey made the decision to prioritize moving his daughter over preserving evidence that could identify her killer. This decision eliminated crucial information forever. Investigators never knew exactly how JonBenét's body had been positioned. They never knew if items in the wine cellar had been arranged in a specific way by the killer. They never knew if there had been additional evidence around the body that was disturbed or destroyed when it was moved. The defense of John Ramsey's actions has always been emotional. He was a father who found his dead child and reacted instinctively to remove her from a cold basement. But this explanation ignores the sophistication of everything else the family did that day. They hired attorneys within hours. They limited their cooperation with police. They controlled access to their surviving son. They made strategic decisions about media engagement. These weren't people acting purely on emotion. These were people implementing a plan. In September 1998, a grand jury was convened to examine evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case. For 13 months, 23 citizens heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, reviewed thousands of pages of documents, and examined physical evidence that has never been fully disclosed to the public. In October 1999, they voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse, resulting in death and accessory to a crime. District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign those indictments. For 14 years, the public was told that no charges had been filed because the evidence was insufficient. The grand jury's actual decision was sealed by court order and hidden from public view. When the indictments were finally released in 2013, they revealed that 12 citizens who had heard evidence unavailable to the public believed the Ramseys should face criminal charges. The specific language of the indictments is crucial. The grand jury didn't charge the Ramseys with murder. They charged them with child abuse, resulting in death, and with being accessories after the fact. The exact wording stated that John and Patsy Ramsey did unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permit a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health, which resulted in the death of JonBenét Ramsey. The accessory charges stated that they did render assistance to a person with intent to hinder, delay, and prevent the discovery, detention, apprehension, prosecution, conviction, and punishment of such person for the commission of a crime. This language tells us what the grand jury believed happened. They believe someone in that house killed JonBenét, and they believe John and Patsy Ramsey helped that person avoid prosecution. The charges don't specify who they were protecting, but given the family dynamics and the evidence presented, the implication is that they were protecting their son, Burke. What evidence convinced the grand jury to reach these conclusions? We know pieces of what they heard, based on court documents and testimony that has been made public over the years. The pineapple evidence. JonBenét had eaten fresh pineapple 1 to 2 hours before her death. A bowl of pineapple was found on the kitchen table with fingerprints from Burke and Patsy Ramsey. Both parents insisted they had not fed JonBenét pineapple that night and that she had gone straight to bed asleep after returning from the Christmas party. This evidence directly contradicted their timeline and suggested JonBenét was awake and downstairs after they returned home. The behavioral evidence. Multiple witnesses testified about the family's behavior in the hours and days following JonBenét's death. This included their immediate hiring of attorneys, their refusal to be interviewed separately, their control over access to Burke, and their orchestrated media appearances designed to shape public opinion rather than assist the investigation. The staging evidence. Forensic experts testified about evidence suggesting the crime scene had been staged to look like the work of an intruder. This included the elaborate ransom note written on materials from inside the house, the ligature device created from household items, and the positioning of evidence in ways that seemed designed to mislead investigators. The timeline inconsistencies. The family's statements about the events of Christmas night contain multiple inconsistencies that investigators could never resolve. These weren't minor memory lapses, but fundamental contradictions about who was awake when, what time certain events occurred, and what family members knew about each other's activities. The grand jury had access to evidence that the public has never seen. They heard testimony from witnesses who haven't spoken publicly. They reviewed investigative reports that remain sealed. They examined physical evidence that has never been fully disclosed. After hearing this evidence for 13 months, they believed charges were warranted. District Attorney Alex Hunter's refusal to sign the indictments had less to do with the strength of the evidence than with his assessment of whether a conviction was possible. Hunter knew that the case would be defended by some of the most skilled criminal attorneys in the country. He knew that the crime scene contamination would create reasonable doubt. He knew that the passage of time had compromised witness memories and physical evidence. He made a strategic decision that prosecution was unlikely to succeed, even with evidence that convinced a grand jury. But Hunter's decision doesn't change what the grand jury concluded. 12 citizens who heard evidence that the public has never seen believe that John and Patsy Ramsey should be charged with child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. They believed the family was protecting someone, and they believed that someone had killed JonBenét. The behavior of the Ramsey family in the hours, days, and years following JonBenét's death has been analyzed by forensic psychologists, criminal investigators, and behavioral experts. While behavior alone cannot prove guilt, patterns of behavior can indicate consciousness of guilt, deception, and attempts to control information. Dr. Stephen Pitt, a forensic psychiatrist who consulted on the case, identified several behavioral patterns that were inconsistent with innocent family members seeking to find their daughter's killer. Immediate legal representation. Within hours of JonBenét's body being found, the Ramsey family had hired criminal defense attorneys. This decision preceded any suggestion by police that the family was under suspicion. Most families of murder victims cooperate fully with investigators and seek legal representation only after being advised they are potential suspects. The Ramseys hired attorneys before they needed them, suggesting they anticipated being investigated. Controlled media engagement. Rather than making public pleas for information about their daughter's killer, the Ramsey family orchestrated carefully managed media appearances designed to present their preferred narrative. These appearances were scripted, rehearsed, and designed to influence public opinion rather than generate investigative leads. Innocent families typically make emotional, unscripted pleas for help finding their loved one's killer. Restricted access to Burke. The family immediately limited investigators' access to their surviving son. Burke was interviewed by police, but only under heavily controlled circumstances with attorneys present. Most families of murder victims want their surviving children to provide any information that might help catch the killer. The Ramseys treated Burke as someone who needed protection from investigators, rather than someone who might assist them. Refusal of separate interviews. For months after JonBenét's death, John and Patsy Ramsey refused to be interviewed by police unless they could be questioned together, with their attorneys present and with limitations on topics and duration. This behavior suggested they were coordinating their stories, rather than providing independent accounts of events. Innocent family members typically want to provide as much information as possible and don't need to coordinate their responses. Strategic polygraph testing. When the Ramseys eventually agreed to polygraph tests, they chose their own examiner and controlled the conditions under which the tests were administered. The results were never made public, and the testing was done in a way that prevented law enforcement from using the results in court. Most innocent family members welcome polygraph testing by law enforcement as a way to eliminate themselves as suspects. Control of information. The Ramsey family hired private investigators, public relations specialists, and legal consultants to manage the flow of information about the case. They worked actively to shape media coverage and public opinion. They leaked information that supported their preferred narrative, while fighting to suppress information that raised questions about their behavior. Innocent families typically want all available information to be examined by investigators. Burke's behavior. Perhaps most telling was the behavior of Burke Ramsey, both as a child and later as an adult. Multiple investigators noted that Burke showed unusual affect when discussing his sister's death. He appeared detached, sometimes smiling or laughing when discussing serious topics, and seemed more interested in discussing his hobbies than his sister's murder. In 2016, when Burke gave his first public interview to Dr. Phil McGraw, his behavior continued to raise questions. He smiled frequently when discussing his sister's death, showed little emotion when describing traumatic events, and gave answers that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Mental health experts noted that while people process trauma differently, Burke's presentation was inconsistent with someone who had lost a beloved sibling to murder. Dr. Jim Clemente, a former FBI profiler, analyzed Burke's behavior in The Doctor. Phil interviewed and noted several concerning patterns: inappropriate affect when discussing serious topics, apparent coaching in his responses, and what appeared to be deceptive body language when asked direct questions about his knowledge of events. The family's coordinated response. Perhaps most importantly, the Ramsey family's behavior suggested a coordinated response rather than the chaotic reactions typical of families devastated by unexpected tragedy. Their decisions were strategic, their public statements were consistent, and their actions protected their legal interests while limiting investigators' access to information. This pattern of behavior doesn't prove the family killed JonBenét, but it demonstrates consciousness of guilt and suggests they knew more about her death than they ever admitted. Innocent families seek justice. Guilty families seek protection. The Ramsey family's behavior pattern from the 26th of December 1996 forward was consistent with people who needed protection, not justice. For nearly 3 decades, the official position of the Boulder District Attorney's Office has been that an intruder killed JonBenét Ramsey. This position became formalized in 2008 when District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a letter exonerating the Ramsey family based on DNA evidence. But a careful examination of the evidence reveals that the intruder theory has always been based more on reasonable doubt than on reasonable evidence. The ransom note. If an intruder wrote the 2.5-page ransom note found on the Ramsey staircase, when did they write it? The note was written on paper from inside the house using a pen from inside the house. Crime scene investigators found what appeared to be a practice draft, suggesting the writer made multiple attempts to get the wording right. The note demanded exactly $118,000, not a round number, but the precise amount of John Ramsey's recent bonus from Access Graphics. How would a random intruder know this specific figure? The bonus amount was not public information. It was known only to the Ramsey family and possibly some executives at Access Graphics. The note contained phrases that appeared to come from movies, particularly Speed and Dirty Harry. It referenced John's business specifically and included detailed instructions about withdrawing money in specific denominations. Most genuine ransom notes are brief and functional. This note was theatrical and elaborate. If an intruder wrote this note after killing JonBenét, what was its purpose? If they wrote it before killing her, why did they leave it after she was dead? The note promised a phone call between 8 and 10 a.m., but no call ever came. The entire ransom scenario was meaningless if there was no live victim to exchange for money. The crime scene. An intruder would need to explain how they entered the house, moved through multiple floors without being detected, found JonBenét's bedroom, removed her from that room, took her to the basement, assaulted her, killed her, wrote a lengthy ransom note, and exited the house, all while a family of 3 slept upstairs. The house had no signs of forced entry. Every door was found locked the next morning. The basement window that some theories suggest as an entry point showed no clear evidence of recent disturbance, and there was an undisturbed spiderweb across part of the opening. The intruder would need to be familiar enough with the house layout to navigate the complex basement and locate the wine cellar where JonBenét was found. The house had been on a Christmas tour weeks earlier, so it's possible someone gained familiarity that way, but this requires believing in a remarkably patient and sophisticated criminal. The staging. Multiple aspects of the crime scene suggested staging rather than a genuine assault by an intruder. The ligature device was constructed from materials found in the house cord and a paintbrush belonging to Patsy Ramsey. The device was more elaborate than necessary for strangulation and appeared designed to support a narrative rather than accomplish a murder efficiently. The duct tape found on JonBenét's mouth had no saliva and appeared to be applied after death. The wrist bindings were so loose that they provided no actual restraint. These elements suggest someone trying to create the appearance of a violent intruder, assault rather than the reality of one. The timeline. The intruder theory requires believing that someone spent hours inside the Ramsey house while the family slept. They wrote a ransom note, assaulted and killed JonBenét, staged the crime scene, and somehow escaped without detection. This timeline is possible, but highly improbable, given the size of the house and the number of people sleeping inside. The DNA evidence. The unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing has been the primary support for the intruder theory since 2008. However, this DNA evidence has significant limitations that make it less conclusive than it initially appeared. The DNA was found in extremely small amounts, what forensics experts call low copy number DNA. Such small amounts are susceptible to contamination and can be transferred innocently through secondary contact. The underwear JonBenét was wearing when found was brand new, taken from a package that had never been washed. DNA from factory workers, package handlers, or store employees could explain the presence of unknown male DNA. In 2008, when District Attorney Mary Lacey exonerated the family, she stated that finding the same unknown male DNA on 2 pieces of clothing made innocent transfer unlikely. However, subsequent analysis revealed that the DNA profiles from different pieces of clothing weren't perfect matches and might not have come from the same person. More importantly, DNA evidence alone cannot establish timeline, intent, or sequence of events. Even if the unknown male DNA came from JonBenét's killer, it cannot explain the ransom note written with materials from inside the house, the family's behavior patterns, or the staging elements that suggest intimate knowledge of the household. The intruder theory has been the official position because it's the only theory that doesn't require prosecuting the surviving family members. But being the official position doesn't make it the most likely scenario based on the totality of evidence. The intruder theory requires believing in a remarkably sophisticated criminal who spent hours inside the Ramsey house, demonstrated intimate knowledge of the family's finances, had access to household materials, and somehow escaped without leaving clear evidence of entry or exit. The family involvement theories, while legally challenging to prosecute, provide more coherent explanations for the ransom note, the staging, the behavioral patterns, and the timeline inconsistencies. The grand jury that heard evidence for 13 months concluded that family involvement was more likely than an unknown intruder. Their conclusion deserves more weight than it has been given in public discourse about this case. The JonBenét Ramsey case represents one of the most sophisticated legal defense strategies ever implemented in an American criminal investigation. From the moment JonBenét's body was found, the Ramsey family deployed resources that effectively insulated them from prosecution for nearly 3 decades. Within hours of the 26th of December 1996, the family had retained criminal defense attorneys. This wasn't a single attorney or a local lawyer. This was a team of specialists in different aspects of criminal defense law, public relations, and media management. The legal team included Brian Morgan and Patrick Burke, prominent Denver criminal defense attorneys with experience in high-profile cases and connections to the local legal community. They immediately began controlling the family's interactions with law enforcement and establishing conditions for any cooperation. Hal Haddon, a Boulder attorney with deep local connections who understood the community dynamics and could influence public opinion in the area where any potential trial would occur. Lynn Wood, a Georgia-based attorney specializing in defamation law, who managed the family's media presence and filed lawsuits against anyone who suggested family involvement in JonBenét's death. This legal team didn't just defend the Ramseys, they went on offense. They shaped media coverage, influenced public opinion, challenged investigative decisions, and created a legal environment where prosecution became increasingly difficult as time passed. The strategy had several components. Controlled cooperation. Rather than refusing to cooperate entirely, which would appear suspicious, the family cooperated selectively and under controlled conditions. They gave interviews to police, but only after months of delay, only with attorneys present, only under time limitations, and only on topics their lawyers approved. This created the appearance of cooperation while limiting the information available to investigators. Information warfare. The legal team worked actively to shape media coverage and public opinion. They leaked information that supported their preferred narrative while fighting to suppress information that raised questions. They provided exclusive access to sympathetic journalists while attacking critical coverage through legal threats. Parallel investigation. The family hired private investigators to conduct their own parallel investigation. This served multiple purposes. It demonstrated their commitment to finding the real killer. It allowed them to identify and neutralize potential evidence before police found it. And it created alternative theories that could create reasonable doubt in any future prosecution. Legal challenges. The defense team challenged every aspect of the investigation through legal motions, media pressure, and political influence. They questioned police competence, challenged evidence collection procedures, and created enough legal obstacles to make prosecution extremely difficult. The wealth factor. The Ramsey family's financial resources allowed them to sustain this comprehensive legal defense indefinitely. They could afford teams of specialists, private investigators, expert witnesses, and public relations consultants. They could fight legal battles for years without economic pressure to settle or compromise. Political pressure. John Ramsey's business connections and community standing created political pressure on local officials. Boulder is a small community where business and political leaders often have personal relationships. Prosecuting a prominent businessman required political courage that not all officials possessed. The result was a legal environment where prosecutors knew that any charges would face years of expensive legal challenges, extensive media scrutiny, and well-funded defense strategies. Even with evidence that convinced a grand jury, prosecutors calculated that conviction was unlikely given the resources arrayed against them. This isn't about whether the Ramsey family is guilty or innocent. This is about how wealth and legal sophistication can effectively place people above the law. Even when evidence suggests criminal charges are warranted, the grand jury believed charges should be filed. 12 citizens who heard evidence unavailable to the public concluded that child abuse resulting in death had occurred and that the family had assisted in covering it up. But those charges were never filed. Not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the legal and political obstacles were too great. District Attorney Alex Hunter admitted years later that he didn't believe he could win a conviction against the Ramsey defense team, regardless of the evidence. This creates a troubling precedent. If families with sufficient resources can effectively insulate themselves from prosecution even when grand juries find evidence of criminal behavior, what does that say about equal justice under law? How many other cases have been influenced by wealth and legal sophistication rather than evidence and facts? The Boulder Police Department's failure to properly secure the crime scene gave the defense team reasonable doubt to work with. The family's immediate deployment of legal resources allowed them to control the investigation's direction from the beginning. The combination of investigative mistakes and legal sophistication created an environment where prosecution became nearly impossible, regardless of what the evidence actually showed. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old when his sister died, and his treatment by both his family and the investigation reveals one of the most troubling aspects of this case. For nearly 3 decades, Burke has been simultaneously protected from scrutiny and presented as an innocent victim, when the evidence suggests he may have been the key to understanding what happened on December 25, 1996. From the moment police arrived at the Ramsey house, Burke's access to investigators was controlled by his parents and their attorneys. This wasn't unusual in the first hour, as parents naturally want to protect their children from trauma. But the level of control extended far beyond normal protective measures. Burke was interviewed by police and social workers multiple times, but always under controlled circumstances with family attorneys present. These interviews were limited in scope and duration. Investigators were not allowed to ask certain questions or pursue certain topics. The interviews were conducted as though Burke was a fragile witness who needed protection, rather than a potential source of crucial information. The content of these early interviews has never been fully disclosed, but portions that have been released show Burke displaying unusual affect when discussing his sister's death. He appeared more interested in discussing his toys and hobbies than in helping investigators understand what happened to JonBenét. This could be normal childhood coping behavior, or it could indicate knowledge that he was instructed not to share. The enhanced 911 call suggests Burke was awake and participating in family discussions during the crucial first minutes after JonBenét was reported missing. If this is accurate, it means the family's core narrative about Burke sleeping through everything was false. It raises questions about what Burke knew and when he knew it. The pineapple evidence connects directly to Burke. His fingerprints were found on the bowl of pineapple discovered on the kitchen table. JonBenét had eaten pineapple 1 to 2 hours before her death, but her parents insisted they had not fed it to her and that she had gone straight to bed asleep. If Burke was serving pineapple to his sister after they returned home from the Christmas party, it places both children awake and downstairs during the time frame when the crime occurred. Burke remained largely out of public view for 20 years after his sister's death. He was homeschooled, lived in different states, and maintained almost complete privacy. This level of seclusion goes beyond normal protection of a child witness and suggests ongoing concern about what he might reveal if questioned extensively. In 2016, Burke agreed to his first public interview with Dr. Phil McGraw. The interview was heavily promoted as Burke's chance to finally tell his story and defend himself against years of speculation. But the interview raised more questions than it answered. Burke's demeanor during the interview was striking. He smiled frequently when discussing serious topics, including his sister's death. He appeared coached in his responses, giving answers that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. When asked direct questions about his knowledge of events, he showed body language that behavioral experts interpreted as deceptive. Dr. Jim Clemente, a former FBI profiler, analyzed Burke's interview and noted several concerning patterns. Burke's inappropriate affect suggested either coaching to appear unconcerned or genuine lack of emotional connection to his sister's death. His answers to specific questions about the night of December 25 were evasive and seemed designed to avoid providing detailed information. Burke's lawsuit against CBS, following their 2016 documentary, suggests ongoing legal protection and concern about public perception. The documentary explicitly presented the theory that Burke had struck JonBenét in a moment of anger and that his parents had covered up the incident. Rather than simply denying these allegations, Burke filed a $750 million defamation lawsuit that was settled out of court for undisclosed terms. The settlement pattern is significant. Rather than allowing facts to be determined in court through discovery and testimony, Burke chose to settle confidentially. This protects him from having to answer detailed questions under oath, but also prevents the public from learning what evidence the documentary producers believed they had to support their theories. The legal protection of Burke extends beyond normal attorney-client privilege. His parents' legal team worked for decades to limit his exposure to investigation and public scrutiny. This protection continued into adulthood, suggesting ongoing concern about what he might reveal if questioned without legal constraints. Burke is now in his 30s, well past any age where special protection would be justified. If he has information that could help solve his sister's murder, there's no legitimate reason for that information to remain protected. If he witnessed what happened, if he was involved in what happened, or if he was told things by his parents that they never told investigators, the public and law enforcement deserve access to that information. The continued protection of Burke Ramsey represents one of the most troubling aspects of this case. A grand jury concluded that child abuse resulting in death had occurred in the Ramsey household, and that family members had helped cover up what happened. The evidence suggests that Burke was present, awake, and potentially involved in the events of the 25th of December 1996. Yet for nearly 30 years, he has been treated as someone who needs protection rather than someone who should provide answers. This protection has been maintained through wealth, legal sophistication, and a system that prioritizes the rights of potential witnesses over the rights of victims to have crimes fully investigated. After 28 years of investigation, millions of dollars spent, thousands of pages of documents, and countless hours of expert analysis, fundamental questions about JonBenét Ramsey's death remain unanswered. These aren't minor details about procedure or timeline. These are basic facts about what happened that night and who was responsible. What did Burke Ramsey see and hear on the 25th of December 1996? The enhanced 911 call suggests he was awake during the first crucial minutes after his sister was reported missing. His fingerprints were on the pineapple bowl that connects to JonBenét's last meal. Yet his knowledge of events has been protected by legal barriers for nearly 3 decades. What could a 9-year-old boy tell us that his family has spent so much effort to conceal? Why did the family immediately hire criminal defense attorneys before they were considered suspects? Most families of murder victims cooperate fully with investigators and seek legal representation only after being advised they might be charged. The Ramseys hired a legal team within hours of finding JonBenét's body before police had even begun to focus on them as potential suspects. What did they know that made them anticipate needing criminal defense? What evidence convinced a grand jury that child abuse resulting in death had occurred? For 13 months, 23 citizens heard testimony and reviewed evidence that has never been fully disclosed to the public. They concluded that charges should be filed against John and Patsy Ramsey for child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. What did they hear that convinced them criminal charges were warranted? Why did District Attorney Alex Hunter refuse to sign the grand jury indictments? Hunter stated publicly that the evidence was insufficient to prosecute, but years later admitted that his decision was based on his belief that he couldn't win a conviction against the Ramsey defense team. What was the real reason he chose not to pursue charges that a grand jury had approved? What investigative leads were not pursued because of political or legal pressure? Multiple former Boulder police detectives have suggested that certain aspects of the investigation were limited by pressure from the district attorney's office and concerns about the family's legal team. What evidence was not collected, what witnesses were not interviewed, and what theories were not pursued because of these limitations. Why has Burke Ramsey never been questioned as an adult without legal protection? Burke is now in his 30s and has been the subject of persistent speculation about his knowledge of events. He has given only one public interview, which raised more questions than it answered. Why has he never been questioned extensively by law enforcement without the protection of attorneys and controlled conditions? What role did financial resources play in shaping the investigation? The Ramsey family deployed teams of attorneys, private investigators, public relations specialists, and expert witnesses to influence every aspect of the case. How did this financial advantage affect the investigation's direction and conclusions? What evidence exists that has never been publicly disclosed? Grand jury proceedings are secret, investigative files contain information that hasn't been released, and witness testimony includes statements that have never been made public. What do these sealed records contain that might change public understanding of the case? Why has no one ever been charged, despite evidence that convinced a grand jury? In American law, grand jury indictments represent a finding that probable cause exists to believe crimes have been committed. When prosecutors refuse to pursue grand jury indictments, it suggests political or practical considerations outweighed legal ones. What made this case different from others where grand jury decisions are followed? What happened to the investigation after the 2008 exoneration? When District Attorney Mary Lacy issued her letter exonerating the Ramsey family based on DNA evidence, she effectively ended active investigation of family involvement. What leads were abandoned? What theories were dropped? And what evidence was ignored because of this decision? These questions remain unanswered, not because evidence doesn't exist, but because the systems designed to find truth, law enforcement, prosecution, and courts have been influenced by factors beyond evidence and facts. Wealth, legal sophistication, political pressure, and media manipulation have shaped this case more than forensic analysis and investigative work. The continued protection of information, the sealed grand jury testimony, the controlled access to key witnesses, and the influence of legal teams have created an environment where truth has been secondary to legal strategy. This represents a failure not just of this specific investigation, but of the systems designed to ensure equal justice under law. The JonBenét Ramsey case didn't just fail to solve a child's murder. It demonstrated how wealth and legal sophistication can effectively place people above the law in the American justice system. The techniques pioneered by the Ramsey legal team have become a playbook for how affluent families can avoid prosecution even when evidence suggests criminal behavior. Immediate legal representation. The Ramsey family's decision to hire criminal defense attorneys within hours of finding JonBenét's body before they were considered suspects established a new standard for wealthy families facing potential investigation. This immediate deployment of legal resources allows families to control information flow, limit investigative access, and shape the direction of investigations from the beginning. Controlled cooperation. Rather than refusing to cooperate entirely, which appears suspicious, the Ramseys demonstrated how to cooperate selectively under conditions that limit exposure while maintaining the appearance of assistance. This technique allows families to claim they're helping investigators while actually controlling what information is available. Information warfare. The use of media specialists, public relations experts, and selective leaks to influence public opinion has become standard practice for wealthy families facing criminal investigation. The Ramsey case showed how aggressive media management can create alternative narratives that compete with law enforcement theories. Parallel investigations. Hiring private investigators to conduct independent investigations serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates commitment to finding truth. It allows families to identify and neutralize potential evidence before law enforcement discovers it. And it creates alternative theories that can be used to create reasonable doubt. Legal intimidation. The use of defamation, lawsuits, and legal threats to silence critics and control information became a central strategy in the Ramsey case. This technique discourages media coverage, intimidates potential witnesses, and creates financial risks for anyone who challenges the family's preferred narrative. Political pressure. The deployment of business connections, community standing, and political influence to affect prosecutorial decisions demonstrated how wealthy families can create pressure on elected officials who must consider political consequences of their decisions. Long-term legal protection. The continued protection of family members, particularly Burke Ramsey, for decades after the original crime, shows how legal strategies can be sustained indefinitely when families have sufficient resources These techniques have been refined and used in other high-profile cases involving wealthy families. The playbook established in the Ramsey case has influenced how criminal defense is practiced at the highest levels, creating a two-tier justice system where the wealthy face different standards of accountability than ordinary citizens. The impact on law enforcement. Police departments and prosecutors' offices have had to adapt to these sophisticated defense strategies, often without equivalent resources. The Boulder Police Department was unprepared for the legal and media challenges they faced, and their mistakes created opportunities that the defense team exploited effectively. The impact on the media. The aggressive media management in the Ramsey case changed how journalists cover criminal investigations involving wealthy families. News organizations now face greater legal risks when reporting on cases involving affluent suspects, which can limit public access to information about criminal investigations. The impact on public trust. The perception that the Ramsey family avoided prosecution despite evidence that convinced a grand jury has contributed to public skepticism about equal justice under law. When wealthy families can effectively avoid accountability for serious crimes, it undermines confidence in the justice system's fairness. The precedent established. The Ramsey case created precedents that make prosecution of wealthy families more difficult in similar cases. Defense attorneys can point to the Ramsey case as an example of how investigative mistakes, media pressure, and legal challenges can prevent prosecution even when evidence exists. The continued mystery. Nearly 30 years later, JonBenét's murder remains officially unsolved. No one has been held accountable for her death. The family continues to maintain their innocence while benefiting from legal protections that prevent full examination of the evidence. This outcome represents a failure of the justice system to provide accountability when a child's life has been taken. The broader implications. The techniques used to protect the Ramsey family from prosecution are available only to those with significant financial resources. This creates a justice system where wealth determines access to protection from criminal prosecution, fundamentally undermining the principle of equal justice under law. The JonBenét Ramsey case will be remembered not just as an unsolved murder, but as a demonstration of how American justice can be manipulated by those with sufficient resources. The legal strategies that protected this family from prosecution have become standard practice for wealthy defendants, creating systemic advantages that ordinary citizens don't enjoy. This legacy extends far beyond Boulder, Colorado. Every prosecutor now knows that charging wealthy families means facing teams of specialists, extensive media campaigns, and legal challenges that can last for years. Every police department knows that investigating affluent suspects means dealing with parallel investigations, controlled cooperation, and political pressure. The case represents the evolution of criminal defense, from protecting clients within the legal system to manipulating the system itself. The Ramseys didn't just avoid conviction, they avoided prosecution entirely despite evidence that convinced a grand jury. This outcome demonstrates how legal sophistication and financial resources can effectively place people above the law. The questions that remain. The 26th of December, 1996. A 6-year-old girl was found dead in her family's basement. For 28 years, we've been told this was a mystery. We've been told the evidence was inconclusive. We've been told that without DNA identification of an intruder, the case cannot be solved. But that narrative ignores what we actually know. A grand jury that heard evidence for 13 months concluded that child abuse resulting in death had occurred in the Ramsey household, and that family members had helped cover it up. Their conclusion was based on evidence that the public has never seen, testimony that has never been disclosed, and facts that remain sealed in court records. The behavioral evidence suggests a family that knew more than they admitted and acted to protect themselves rather than find their daughter's killer. The immediate hiring of criminal attorneys, the controlled cooperation with investigators, the contamination of the crime scene, the coordinated media strategy, and the decades-long legal protection of key witnesses all point to consciousness of guilt rather than innocent victimization. The forensic evidence raises questions that have never been adequately answered. Why was JonBenét awake and eating pineapple when her parents said she was asleep? Why was the ransom note written on materials from inside the house? Why was the crime scene staged to look like the work of an intruder? Why do timeline inconsistencies persist in the family's statements? The legal maneuvering demonstrates how wealth and influence can effectively place people above the law. The deployment of teams of specialists, the control of information, the manipulation of media coverage, and the political pressure on prosecutors created an environment where justice became secondary to legal strategy. Most importantly, the continued protection of Burke Ramsey represents an ongoing obstruction of justice. A man in his 30s who was present during the crucial time period, whose fingerprints were on evidence connected to his sister's last meal, and whose voice may have been captured on the 911 call, continues to be shielded from extensive questioning by law enforcement. The DNA evidence that has been used to justify the official intruder theory is far less conclusive than it has been presented. Trace amounts of DNA on clothing that had never been washed could have innocent explanations. Even if the DNA came from an intruder, it cannot explain the ransom note, the staging, the behavioral patterns, or the timeline inconsistencies that point to family involvement. The truth about what happened on the 25th of December 1996 remains hidden not because evidence doesn't exist, but because legal and political systems have failed to pursue that evidence aggressively. A child's murder has gone unpunished for 28 years, not because the case is unsolvable, but because solving it would require challenging one of the most sophisticated legal defense strategies ever implemented. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old when she died. She deserved better than what happened to her that night. She deserved better than an investigation that was compromised from the first hour. She deserved better than a legal system that could be manipulated by wealth and influence. She deserved justice. The questions we should be asking are not about DNA or intruders. The questions we should be asking are about why a grand jury's conclusions were ignored, why key witnesses remain protected from questioning, and why a family's behavior patterns were explained away rather than examined. The technology exists to finally get answers. The evidence exists to demand accountability. The legal precedents exist to pursue prosecution. The only thing missing is the will to challenge a legal and political system that has protected this family for nearly 3 decades. Until Burke Ramsey is questioned extensively without legal protection, until the sealed grand jury testimony is released, until the evidence is examined without regard for the family's wealth and influence, JonBenét's murder will remain a testament to how American justice can be bought, manipulated, and avoided by those with sufficient resources. The case that shocked America in 1996 should shock us even more today, not because a child was murdered, but because the systems designed to provide justice for murdered children failed so completely and so deliberately. The question isn't who killed JonBenét Ramsey. The question is why, 28 years later, we're still pretending we don't know. If you want to see more investigations that examine how wealth and influence affect criminal justice, subscribe to Unresolved, a case study. Hit that like button if this analysis raised questions you hadn't considered about how this case was handled. Share your thoughts in the comments, but remember, this is about seeking truth and justice for a 6-year-old girl who deserved both. What aspect of the family's behavior do you find most concerning? What questions do you think investigators should have pursued more aggressively? JonBenét Ramsey deserved justice. After 28 years, she still hasn't received it. These aren't just stories. These are real lives, real families, real failures of the systems we depend on to protect children and provide justice. The search for truth continues.